Hi, geography students. This is your second lecture about your agriculture chapter that we will have in week 14. We spoke last time about agriculture in general having three agricultural revolutions over history, across history, and one at about 14,000 years ago, and one during the Industrial Revolution that we've studied so much about. But more recently, in the 1990s through today, we've had what's called the third agricultural revolution, and today we're going to talk about that. The third agricultural revolution doesn't really affect or doesn't really provide food to everyone in the world. There's still some subsistence farming. There's still land that's not attractive for large corporate farms and corporate food making industries. I'll clarify that here in just a minute. But this third agricultural revolution is more recently in the last 30 years has another name for it. It's called the Green Revolution, or the Green Revolution, which is an environmentally friendly movement in our world cultures, is focused on environmental friendliness and sustainability of the environment, and putting a halt to climate change and things like that. So I want to start with the second agricultural revolution that we were talking mostly about in the last video that we had together, because the second agricultural revolution was about surplus, remember, and when surplus was the focus, farming became something that was very destructive for environments. There were artificial chemicals, artificial herbicides, artificial pesticides that were added to soils and to plants and to water systems and all this kind of stuff. In the second agricultural revolution, there were medications and hormones and all sorts of things added to the feed for animals that were being produced in these farms, so that, for instance, a chicken would grow, growth hormone was added to chicken feed, so that chickens would grow as quickly as possible, so that farmers could get them from egg to your produce, your meat counter in Kroger as quickly as possible. As large as possible, as quickly as possible. So there were a whole lot of artificial things added. Antibiotics were added to animal feed because animals were held in such close quarters that bugs and viruses and stuff, bacteria and viruses and stuff could spread between them so easily. And there are standards that have to be met for food production, and so sick animals can't be sold for human consumption. So all these pre-medicated animals, are still in the food supply, and all of those antibiotics and hormones and antidepressants in some cases are added to animal feed. In the case of chickens, they do that to try to prevent stampedes, so that chickens, they're very excitable, chickens are, and they can run and stampede and crush each other, and so that cuts down on the profits, right? So all of these artificial things are added to the food supply in the second agricultural revolution. Toward the end, and in the 1900s of the second agricultural revolution, all these unnatural things are added to the food supply, and it has a lot of environmental costs, because there's runoff of these things and it goes into the natural ecosystem, and it can affect wildlife, things that are not produced in our food system. You might have known recently, in the last 10 years or so, there are some issues with honeybee colonies dying, and we don't know whether, what that's being caused from. So we don't necessarily have a definite answer for what's causing that. So the effects of the second agricultural revolution were very environmentally destructive. We talked about the Dust Bowl together when we were having a discussion about agriculture in our first lesson from this week, and the Dust Bowl is just one example about how human environmental interaction can and does change the climate of an area, change the rainfall patterns of an area, change the natural landscape of an area. And so that interaction, the surplus-oriented production in the second agricultural revolution, had a lot of environmental costs. And so in the last 30 years, science, and in particular a field called biotechnology, so biological advances, whether you're talking about plants or animals, so biotech is advancements in the science that will make, that is trying to focus in part on making products that can support what we call a green revolution. So for instance, there are biotechnology firms. Let me talk about something first that's not in the food supply, but that's necessary to get food dispersed. There are a lot of biotech companies that are working on a way to produce diesel fuel or some kind of diesel-like fuel from algae and byproducts of algae and things like that. So these are biotech focuses on trying to figure out a better way to produce the fuels that we need, the foods that we need, the transportation systems that we need, so that environmental costs, environmental impacts go down. They are lessened by that human-environmental interaction. And so the green revolution is part of this third agricultural revolution, where you hear about things like genetically modified organisms, GMO, genetically modified organisms. For instance, there is a company called Monsanto, and it owns a weed killer called Roundup. Some of you probably use it in your backyard. But if you are a corporate farmer, an industrialized farmer that produces corn or soybeans or some huge cash crop for surplus, Monsanto has used biotech information to genetically modify corn, soybeans, these kinds of things, so that you can spray Roundup on it. Roundup kills just about anything it touches. The stuff you don't want it to kill, it kills. But if you want your crop to be healthy but not have to be so careful about spreading your herbicide out there to kill the weeds, you can genetically modify the corn plant, for instance, so that you can spray Roundup on it and it won't kill it. Roundup might be absorbed in there. You have genetically modified the DNA of that plant in order to resist that poison, that plant poison, for instance. And so this creates a situation in which you've got a much higher yield and proprietary or trademarked or patented plants that not everybody has the right to grow because it's their in particular formula really for that seed. So that's part of what biotech is doing. GMOs are not considered nowadays to be something that is friendly with the green revolution because GMOs, I mentioned honeybees a minute ago, they are modifying plants, many of which honeybees need, for their honey and for their survival. And so some people speculate that genetically modified organisms in the environment are one of the reasons why we're losing some of the natural species in our ecosystems. And so this is something that came about during the third agricultural revolution, but has kind of got a bad name in our society these days. Instead, some of the movements in biotech that are directly related with our food supply are cultured foods or cloned organisms, mainly meat products. Cultured meat, I'm going to put a short video in our folder for this week for you to watch a news story about what cultured meat is. So first let's talk about this word here. This is referring to like a petri dish. You know how you use the word culture for bacteria? So if you have a sore throat, they can take a swab of your throat and they can culture it in a petri dish to grow it so they can examine what it is. Do you have strep throat, for instance? They can tell whether you have strep throat because does Streptococcus or whatever it's called, whatever the bacteria is called, does it grow in that petri dish? Did you culture it? So when we say cultured foods, there is a huge company in Memphis. I'm not sure the name of it. You can certainly look it up. But there's a huge company in Memphis that is culturing meat right now because meat producers are very destructive people for the environment. And a lot of the empirical evidence shows that meat production, the beef industry in the United States, is very destructive for the environment. There's a lot of additives that are put into chicken feed, for instance, that makes the chicken itself not necessarily the best thing for us to consume. And so this company in Memphis, Tennessee, is taking teeny tiny little minute, y'all know that word minute, the tiniest nano pieces of DNA from a chicken breast, and they are culturing it in a petri dish, so to speak, so that it grows into what looks like a chicken breast, so that it can be something that doesn't have an environmental impact. It's grown in a lab from original pieces of chicken DNA, but it's never been on a chicken in its life. And so cultured meat, cultured foods of all sorts, cloned meats, cloned foods of all sorts, that's an L, are part of this third agricultural revolution, where we are trying to find answers to the environmental costs that the second agricultural revolution resulted in. We still focus on that surplus. Surplus is a big deal in capitalism, in our corporate, cultural, global environment. But the third agricultural revolution has a green focus, which is environmental sustainability, environmental protection. Part of the Green Revolution also includes movements that began in the 1990s and early 2000s, like the locavore movement, which means that you eat things only within a certain radius of your house, 100 miles, 200 miles, things that were produced within that radius of your house, a locavore movement, slow foods movement, urban foraging movements, all of these kinds of resistance movements that have popped up to counteract the environmental cost that the second agricultural revolution seemed to disregard the environment and sustainability after the second second agricultural revolution. So in the third agricultural revolution, you've got all kinds of science and biotech trying to find new ways to produce food for us that have a lower environmental impact, but there's also a lot of grassroots resistance movements like locavorism or slow foods, farm to table, those kinds of things. So look at the end of chapter 11, I believe it is, for agriculture, to read about some of these things and look at the places in the world where these kinds of experiments, I guess you'd say, are happening, are taking off, because we're in the middle of the third agricultural revolution. And you will be able to, after having this class, you will be able to better understand food supply and those supply chains for getting food to the people who need them, and is everyone getting food that they need? And we will be able to better understand all of that information from this chapter. Please text me with questions.